Hi, welcome to Chapter 6, Adapting to Others, Diversity, and Communication. Preview of Chapter 6. What are the four forms of diversity? What is culture? What is intercultural communication? How does culture influence communication? What are cultural values? What are the stages of intercultural competence? We are on our very last communication principle of our 5 principles. Appropriately adapt your message to others. We have 4 forms of human diversity. The 4 forms of human diversity to know are sexual orientation, ethnicity, age, and gender. We'll briefly discuss age and gender. Age. Each generation has different characteristics. Matures were born between 1925 and 1942, and they typically value hard work, have a sense of duty, are willing to sacrifice, have a sense of what is right, and work quickly. Boomers were born between 1943 and 1960, and they typically value personal fulfillment and optimism, crusade for causes, buy now, pay later mentality, support equal rights for all, and work efficiently. Generation X is typically described as having been born between 1961 and 1981. They tend to live with uncertainty, consider balance important, live for today, save, and consider every job as a contract. Millennials, born between 1982 and 2002, typically are close to their parents, feel special, are goal-oriented, are team-oriented, and focus on achievement. How does gender influence communication? Masculine men tend to communicate from an instrumental orientation, an emphasis on doing. There's a me against the world view of self and reality. Feminine women tend to communicate from an expressive orientation, connecting with others and constructing relationships and community. These are tendencies, not laws. Androgynous individuals tend to communicate from high levels of both instrumental and expressive orientations. One's gender is generally learned and is socially reinforced by others, as well as by one's life, experience, and genetics. Some scholars prefer to study gender as a subset of culture, a co-culture, as a form of cultural diversity on the level of such other aspects as race, ethnicity, and religion. Men often communicate to rapport, women often communicate to establish rapport. To bridge the gap, we suggest, first, work to understand the differences discussed. Second, make an insightful examination of your own behavior in light of the differences discussed. And then determine how to conform to and differ from the description of members of your sex. Third, be a gender researcher yourself. Make a note of differences as well as similarities between you and members of the opposite sex. Be careful not to ascribe differences in communication only to gender, but to consider a host of other reasons such as age, personality, and culture. Finally, make a conscious effort to adapt your behavior appropriately. We don't mean that you have to always communicate as you think members of your sex would or should communicate, but be mindful of how you interact with others to enhance the quality of your relationships with them. How does gender influence communication? Women have a tendency to engage in rapport talk. In other words, they communicate to connect with others and focus more on the quality of relationships than the information exchange. Men tend to engage in rapport talk. They communicate to create or establish status and focus more on information exchange than on the quality of relationships. What is culture? Culture is a learned system of knowledge, behavior, attitudes, beliefs, values, and norms that is shared by a group of people and shaped from one generation to the next. What is intercultural communication? Intercultural communication occurs when individuals or groups from different cultures or co-culture communicate. What is culture shock? Culture shock includes feelings of confusion, loss, stress, and anxiety that a person may experience when encountering a culture different from his or her own. How does culture influence communication? Our culture and life experiences determine our worldview, or the lens through which people in a given culture perceive the world around them. Worldview is a perspective shared by a culture or group of people about key beliefs and issues such as death, God, and the meaning of life, which influences interaction with others. It's the lens through which people in a given culture perceive the world around them. How does culture influence communication? There are high context and low context cultures. High context cultures rely more explicitly on nonverbal messages, and communicators in high context cultures rely on the context to interpret messages. Low context cultures rely more explicitly on verbal messages, in other words, language, and communicators use fewer contextual cues to interpret information. Great examples of low context cultures include Swiss, German, Scandinavian, American, Australian. Great examples of high context cultures include Asian, Arab, Southern European, and African. Lower context cultures are less aware of nonverbal environment and situation, need detailed background information, tend to segment and compartmentalize information, control information and share it on a need-to-know basis, prefer explicit and careful directions from someone who knows, considers knowledge an important commodity. High context cultures place emphasis on nonverbal expressions in surrounding context. They consider nonverbal cues important. They take into account the environment and the situation. They observe a communication partner's gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice, and overall mood. And they maintain extensive information networks.